Most of you are familiar with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a personality assessment based on Carl Jung's theory of psychological types. But could Jung's theory contain a hidden religious agenda? Let's find out. First, let's examine Jung's background because his major theories came from his occult studies and demonic influence. Jung grew up in a religious home that was filled with bizarre supernatural experiences. Occult researcher Dave Hunt said that, quote, Carl Jung grew up in a haunted house where the poltergeist activity was so intense that his mother kept a daily journal of the spirit activity. This spiritual atmosphere clearly had a profound impact on Jung, and he soon developed an intense interest in studying religious concepts. However, he soon began to doubt the Christian religion in which he'd been raised, and he soon abandoned the faith and began to engage in occult practices. Jung held seances and even wrote his dissertation on the subject. He practiced alchemy, astrology, tarot cards, and even consulted horoscopes. He once wrote that, quote, in cases of difficult diagnosis, I usually get a horoscope. As you can tell, Carl Jung was a very scientific man. The I Ching divination method was also vital to Jung. In fact, this is still taught at most C.G. Jung institutes today, as evidenced by this course description, quote, it provides intensive teaching, individual attention, and small group work with what Jung called the whole practical use of the I Ching that he felt was a basic and necessary part of his psychology. So the basic and necessary part of this man's psychology is an ancient Chinese divination method? Yeah, let that sink in. But Carl Jung received his greatest insights from his trusted spirit guide named Philemon, who would sometimes address Carl Jung as Christ. Considering Jung's background, you can now understand that he got many of his concepts for his theory of psychological types from Eastern mysticism and through his occultism. First, consider how Jung took the four functions and arranged them as pairs of opposites. Intuition opposes sensation, and thinking opposes feeling. So if you have intuition as your dominant function like INTJs, then you'll have sensation as your inferior function. But why did Carl Jung arrange the functions as pairs of opposites like that? Because that's what the spirits told him to do. In his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes an experience in which, quote, ghostly entities haunted his house and contacted him. Jung then describes a series of paranormal events, and all this crazy stuff starts happening. His children are seeing figures move across the room, and all of a sudden the doorbell rings, and it just keeps ringing nonstop. Everyone goes in there, but no one at the door. He can literally see the doorbell moving, and then they begin to speak to him through Philemon, and then he writes it down as the 7 sermons to the dead. And the spirits told Carl Jung some very interesting things. First, they tell Jung that we are made of pairs of opposites. The pairs of opposites are qualities of the pleroma, which are not, because each balanceth each. As we are the pleroma itself, we also have these qualities in us. This is why Jung sees everything as pairs of opposites. We have a male side, but we also have a female side. We have intuition, we have sensation, and so on and so forth. And this concept of pairs of opposites is a duality that makes up a fundamental teaching in mysticism and occultism. For example, a Theosophy magazine from 1889 taught that, quote, the fundamental teaching of occultism that everything in the manifested world is necessarily dual in its nature, and that, quote, in all things we perceive duality, the pairs of opposites. And Baphomet, a favorite symbol among Satanists today, represents the reconciliation of opposites. It reconciles male and female into one gender. It reconciles man and animal. It points up and down, reconciling the cosmic forces with our own worldly forces. It reconciles light and dark, justice and mercy. And the third eye pentagram represents the reconciliation of the 4 elements with the mysterious 5th element, spirit or the astral light. And it points up to the torch of illumination, which one supposedly experiences when the astral light is produced by the reconciliation of the opposites. Interestingly, Eliphas Levi, the man who created the symbol, also said the symbol represented the perfect social order that is supposedly found in socialism. And what is socialism and communism all about? The reconciliation of rich versus poor by abolishing private property. And communism was founded by Karl Marx, who, according to Richard Wurmbrand's book Marx and Satan, may have secretly been a Satanist. And a 1984 article published in the magazine Lucifer said the following, quote, "Inquirers ask, should we resist evils or take them as they come, when the fact is that all these are pairs of opposites which must be reconciled if any progress is to be made." And you see this concept in Eastern religions such as Hinduism or Taoism, represented by the yin and the yang symbol of the light and the dark united into one unit. And that's the whole point of reconciling the opposites. Evil is no longer evil because it cannot exist without good, and therefore they are just two extremes. In fact, you need to recognize your evil side and integrate it with your good side in perfect harmony, and balancing the opposites in your life will lead to power or liberation. Another thing the spirits taught Jung was that Abraxas was the highest god. Now, keep Abraxas in mind because I'm going to say something about him later in this video, but it's important to understand that Carl Jung is essentially a Gnostic. In fact, a man by the name of Dr. Chalquist read the Gnostics and Jung back to back, and he has written an in-depth research article about this on his website. And what he did was he took all of Jung's concepts and juxtapose those with the Gnostic teachings, and you can basically see that they line right up. Now, what do Gnostics generally believe? Well, Gnosticism comes from Kabbalah, and it parallels many concepts from Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. But generally, they think that the world has problems because it was created by a lesser ignorant God, usually defined as Jehovah of the Bible, go figure, who trapped matter, which is bad, with the spirit, which is good. And the ignorant God accidentally created most of us with a hidden spark of divinity, sometimes called the God within, the true self, or the ultimate reality. And through hidden knowledge, the gnosis, and self-discovery, which usually involves occult techniques, spirit guides, and reconciling your opposites, we can find our true self, the God within, the ultimate reality, whereby we can attain liberation or salvation. Now let's talk about the four functions. Jung described us as having perceiving functions, judging functions, and the psychic flow of energy of each function. Now compare that to Buddha's 5 skandhas or aggregates, which describe us as a collection of 5 changing processes. The processes of the physical body, of feelings, of perceptions, of responses, and the flow of consciousness that experiences them all. Jung even wrote a letter in which he correlated the skandhas to the 4 functions. But here's where it gets interesting, because Jung said that we have these 4 functions that come in pairs of opposites, and that there's tension between the functions, there's tension between the opposites. But when we begin to balance our functions, then a 5th function emerges. And you don't really hear about this 5th function very much on typology channels and so on. But the 5th function is called the transcendent function, and this unites the opposites together. Now, where does this concept come from of having 4 functions that are united together with a 5th function? Where does that come from? That has been the foundation of occultism for thousands of years. It's called the classical elements or elementalism. One occult website noted that if you're a newbie to occultism, you, quote, may want to begin with the 4 elements as they provide a general overview of the occult. And the idea is that all structures are comprised of 4 classical elements which can be balanced and united by a mysterious 5th element, sometimes called quintessence, ether, void, or spirit. In astrology, the zodiac types are grouped into 4 main element categories which correlate to 3 zodiac types or triplicities. The free ebook titled 4 Temperaments, Astrology and Personality Testing notes that, quote, the 4 elements were considered to be unstable and in tension with each other. It was believed that the 5th, though not seen, keeps the other elements bound together, though never in perfect balance. Yet the quintessence itself was thought to be the perfect balance. And the pentagram, a symbol associated with satanic rituals and occult practices, is often depicted as representing the 4 elements, with spirit or quintessence being the mysterious 5th element that reconciles the elements together. Many occult practitioners teach that developing your elements, just like developing your functions, will allow you to cast more powerful spells or contact more powerful spirits, which are represented by each of the cardinal points of the pentagram. In alchemy, the 4 elements made up everything, and creating a perfect balance of the 4 elements would produce the 5th element, often called the Philosopher's Stone, allowing them to transform lead into gold. The 5th element was also called the elixir of life, which supposedly brought about immortality. Empedocles, another occultist, correlated the four elements to four gods. The dominant element in your body, kind of like the dominant function in your mind, would produce personality traits that mirrored that of the corresponding god, and you could gain insight into yourself by worshiping or contacting that god according to esoteric teachings. By balancing the elements in your body, you could achieve greater health, wisdom, and experience the ultimate reality. The four humors of Hippocrates, as well as Galen's temperament theory, all contain the same basic premise of the classical elements, and many occult websites have associated Jung's four functions with the four elements, with one person noting that, quote, Carl Jung was the first modern psychologist to identify personality types based on the four elements. You'll even see that the Eastern mystic religions of Tibet, Japan, Greece, China, Hinduism, and even Buddhism all teach that the four elements are there and that they often present as a way of salvation or liberation. For example, quote, in early Buddhism, the four elements are a basis for understanding that leads one through the unbinding of rupa or materiality to the supreme state of pure emptiness or nirvana. But do you see how Carl Jung takes the concept of the pairs of opposites that the demons told him about, and he takes this concept of the four elements with the fifth function that unites them all together, both always taught as a foundation of occultism. He takes them and he rewords them a little bit, and then he puts his theory up within this framework so that without even knowing it, your mind is being conditioned to think in terms of opposites and to think in terms of these four elements that are opposing one another in intention and so forth. So he's teaching everyone occultism without people even realizing they're practicing occultism. Now this brings me to the third thing that the spirits taught Jung, which is that unless we distinguish ourselves, we are, quote, given over to disillusion into nothingness, and that we must become distinct, a process they refer to as the principle of individuation. And the concepts of reconciling your opposites and individuation become so central to Carl Jung's theories that basically he spends the rest of his career fleshing them out. In fact, his book is not about psychological types so much. The full title of the book is Psychological Types, or The Psychology of Individuation. And that's what all this personality stuff is really about. It's about reconciling your opposites and Carl Jung's concept of individuation. Because you see, Carl Jung, he doesn't really care about going around typing people. Carl Jung is a clever salesman, because every clever salesman knows that if you want to sell a product to a buyer, you have to create the need in the buyer's mind, and then you sell them the product. So personality theory is the need, because it shows you you're broken. And then Carl Jung's going to fix you with his concept of individuation, because you see, according to Carl Jung, it's not a good thing that you are a personality type. I mean, if you're an INTJ or INTP or INFP, that's not a good thing, because somewhere along the line, some trauma happened to you or something happened, and you used to have your four elements or four functions all united, but something knocked them out of whack, and one of your cognitive functions bubbled to the top, and you had to rely on that one cognitive function more than the others, and then that knocked you off course and you lost your individuality, and now you're just a mere personality type. You're just one of 16 types or 9 types or whatever. And so Carl Jung's going to fix you with his individuation concept, and that's what the reconciling your opposites is all about, because when you go through individuation, you have to go through the process of reconciling every opposite you have. If you're a male, guess what? You have a female side that you have to develop in yourself. You have an unconscious mind, and you have to bridge that with your conscious mind. You have a dark side, you need to bridge that with your light side, and so on and so forth. And you go through all these things. And of course, you use occult methods like active imaginations, which is trying to induce hallucinations. You might come into contact with spirit guides to show you your true self, and dream interpretation, and all these occult techniques that Carl Jung would encourage people to use. And if you go through individuation right and do it the right way, then you win the grand prize. You become whole. You find wholeness, and you find the God within, and you find out that in fact, you are God. As one person put it, Jung's individuation, quote, is a journey to meet the self and at the same time to meet the divine. Jung himself wrote that the self might equally well be called the God within. Dr. Jeffrey Satinover is a psychiatrist, physicist, and former president of the C.G. Jung Institute in New York, and he said the following, quote, Jung blended psychological reductionism with Gnostic spirituality to produce a modern variant of mystical pagan polytheism in which the multiple images of the instinct, his archetypes, are worshipped as gods. Dr. Richard Knoll is a psychiatrist, scholar, professor, and the author of the books The Young Cult and The Aryan Christ, and he exposed just absolutely crazy stuff about Carl Jung, and his book won an award. I think it was even nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, and in an interview, Knoll described an experience in which Jung became deified by Salome. He said that, quote, Jung himself admitted this was a deification experience and that it was absolutely essential for any personality transformation. Jung thought that you had to have the experience of godlikeness, of self-deification, of literally becoming a god, experiencing yourself as God. And Jung was there to teach people how to do that. Jung even revealed his agenda to transform Christ back into the soothsaying God of the vine. And this quote tells me two things. First, Jung knows his theories are antithetical to Christianity, which they are. Second, Jung is a very clever deceiver who operates in a very subtle way. Just look at how strategic he is. He wants his theories to slowly permeate society and supplant the real Christ by demoting him to a mere myth or archetype. And in the book, The Other Worldview, Exposing Christianity's Greatest Threat, Peter Jones quotes one of Jung's private conversations with his own soul, aka Philemon, in which Jung was instructed to, quote, no longer be a Christian, and that his new calling would be, quote, the new religion and its proclamation. And this quote is a perfect example of what the Bible is referring to when it says that, quote, in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. And if you begin studying the occult, you'll see the same teachings appearing over and over again after people contact their disembodied spirits. It's all about reconciling opposites, ascending to higher levels of consciousness, abandoning Christianity for a so-called higher truth, becoming enlightened, becoming a god, and so on. Now again, MBTI is based on Carl Jung's theory of psychological types. They use the 4 functions that Jung uses. Just like I showed you, they're based on the 4 elements. They use the concept of opposites, which is something Jung got from his demons. And what is the purpose of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator anyway? Well, if you go to their website, they tell you, quote, the purpose of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator personality inventory is to make the theory of psychological types described by C.G. Jung understandable and useful in people's lives. So MBTI's sole purpose is to help everyone understand Jung's theories, to help everyone begin to use it in their lives. When I released my last video talking about how I was done with typology, someone sent me a snarky message that said, don't drink the Kool-Aid, trying to imply like I'm some religious fanatic or something like that, which is funny because, you know, Carl Jung can talk regularly with spirit guides and get his major theories from them, and you know, he can tell people that they're going to become a god and think that he's going to become a god and practice every crazy occult thing that's ever been invented ever, and that's completely normal. But, you know, I'm a Christian, so I'm a religious fanatic. But anyway, that phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid, became popular after some 900 members of a cult drank poisoned Kool-Aid in a mass suicide. And the People's Temple cult was started by a man named Jim Jones. And listen to what he taught.
You are God. I'm a God and you're a God. And I'm a God and I'm going to stay a God until you recognize that you're God. And when you recognize you're God, I shall go back into principle and will not appear as a personality. But until I see all of you knowing who you are, I'm going to be very much what I am. God Almighty God.
Did you see the parallels between what Jim Jones was teaching and what Carl Jung taught about finding the God within or being a God and all this sort of thing? Well, Jim Jones actually admitted one time to being an atheist and that most of his followers were atheists and they were also communists. And what Jim Jones would do is he would take the Bible and he would mix passages and teachings from the scriptures with Gnostic teachings and New Age teachings, and so he would deceive people in that way. And after he died, they said that he was registered in many New Age directories. Well, who's considered one of the fathers, if not the father, of the New Age movement? Carl Jung, because this whole you can become a god, the God within business that New Ageism is all about. The Enneagram is a personality system that was basically popularized by a man named George Gurdjieff, another highly influential man in the New Age movement. And it has roots in Gnosticism and mysticism, just like Jungian theory. And like Jung, George Gurdjieff, Oscar Ichazo, and Claudio Naranjo engaged in various forms of occultism, including hallucinations, meditation techniques, psychedelics, and contact with spirit guides. Now, the Enneagram types people into 9 different personality types, and it's based more on your fears and your motivations. And so the whole goal is for individuals to develop into healthy states in order to achieve liberation and awaken to the true self, or the God within. Now, that phrase true self, it refers to God within, or the Brahman force, and it's a phrase used in Eastern mysticism that is synonymous with the Atman. And the Atman is defined as the first principle, the true self of an individual beyond identification with phenomena, the essence of an individual. In order to obtain liberation, a human being must acquire self-knowledge, which is to realize that one's true self is identical with the transcendent self Brahman, the Hindu concept of God. You see the same teaching in all the esoteric religions. For example, Madame H.P. Blavatsky, co-founder of the occult organization known as the Theosophical Society, channeled spirits who taught her that we have a true divine self. In fact, look at what Theosophy teaches about the skandhas, which Jung himself correlated with his 4 functions. The skandhas are the karmic ingredients which constitute our personal self in each lifetime that we have. They relate to finite, manifested existence only, and thus not to our true spiritual self, which is literally one and the same in essence and identity as Brahman, the Absolute. So do you see what's going on here with Jungian typology and the Enneagram and all these esoteric teachings? They all are based on Eastern mysticism, Gnosticism, and occult teachings. They try to classify you into a type so they can then provide a program for you to become better, with the underlying premise that you have a God within, that divine spark of Gnosticism, a hidden true self that you must discover to achieve liberation or wholeness. And they teach you their occult methods. With Jung, it's all about balancing the opposites, active imaginations, which are hallucinations, spirit guides, and dream interpretation. With the Enneagram, it's spirit guides, meditation, and so forth. It's all the same. And the whole thing is very clever. It's just like rat poison, because you see, when a manufacturer wants to produce rat poison, they know better than to put 100% poison in a block. That's never going to work. No rat is going to touch 100% poison. They will smell it and they'll just walk away from it. So what they do is they take 99% food and they put 1% poison in it. So then the rat comes up and it smells food, and it takes a little nibble and it tastes like food. So it eats the whole block, and in the process it ingests poison with the food, and that poison ultimately kills the rat. And that's what this typology stuff does. And Jung would observe real traits or behaviors in people and then assign those traits or behaviors to a certain function or element, just like Empedocles and other personality theorists have done in the past. And so people take these personality tests and they think, wow, that's so me, because that's the food in this system. That's what you taste, that's what you smell, and you say, well, that does sound like me. And like I said in my last video, there's a grain of truth to typology, because when you take these tests, you supply information. You say, yeah, I'm a little more this way. Yeah, I'm a little more that way. So that's the grain of truth in all this. Now, keep in mind, it's not that accurate. Most people still can't find their personality types. A lot of people are flimsy on 1 or 2 of the dichotomies and so forth. But there's a grain of truth to this. But then what happens is, it's human nature that you want to learn more about self, because you'll say to yourself, well, how can I improve some of these weaknesses or these struggles that I have? And so it sucks you in, and that's the poison, because the whole time your perception changes and you begin to look through a lens of typology for everything. You say, how can I be better as an INTJ? How can I be more social as an INTJ? What are some tips for dating for an INTJ? And so everything gets warped around your type now of what you think. And the whole time your mind is being conditioned to think in terms of opposites, which is a basic prerequisite for occultism, is to think of everything as opposites that need to be reconciled. And you're thinking in terms of your 4 elements, your 4 functions. Again, a basis of all occultism throughout history. And so it's poisoning your mind without you realizing it. Now, where did this idea originate that you can actually become a god? It comes straight from Satan. If you read the Bible, this is the first thing he introduces to Eve in the Garden of Eden by saying, quote, "For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." So Satan has been running this same exact scam in occultism for thousands of years. Oh, you just get the secret knowledge. Get the fruit, get the personality test, get whatever, find out who you really are, get that hidden knowledge. You're going to become a god. You're going to become self-actualized, self-realized. Occult researcher Dave Hunt, in his book, The Seduction of Christianity, observed that, quote, "The bait on the pagan hook has always been the promise of godhood that the serpent offered to Eve." Now, as I mentioned before, one of the things that the spirits taught Jung was that the highest god's name was Abraxas. Occult researcher Linda Kimball noted that, quote, "According to ancient Gnostic texts, Abraxas is the astral serpent, Satan, on the tree who gives the illumination of both good and evil to Adam and Eve, whose eyes were then opened. The powerful occult symbol, the Ouroboros, snake biting its tail, signifies Abraxas, the king worm who rules this world." Now, the Ouroboros is found everywhere in Eastern mysticism, in various occult practices such as alchemy and witchcraft, and even in the secret societies. For example, Freemasonry, an organization with historic ties to Gnosticism that is also alleged to have taught Satan worship at its highest levels, has also used the Ouroboros in many of its symbols. And the Ouroboros pays homage to Satan, and it represents the reconciliation of opposites in Gnosticism because the head meets the tail, reconciling the two opposites, and it represents wholeness as well as time or eternity and even fertility. And Carl Jung loved the serpent symbol in general. In fact, he would wear a large Gnostic ring with a serpent on that, which he would publicly claim was a Christian symbol, but I think we all know better than that at this point. But Carl Jung seemed to especially like the Ouroboros symbol. In fact, you can see it depicted on many of the C.G. Jung Institute websites, and the Wikipedia article for the Ouroboros even mentions Carl Jung. And the Theosophical Society, the occult organization co-founded by Madame H.P. Blavatsky, teaches the idea of the true self that is identical with God, and it uses the Ouroboros in its logo. And many of you would probably recognize the Enneagram symbol. However, what you see today is not the original depiction of the symbol. The original symbol for the Enneagram was enclosed in an Ouroboros. Now, I've had a diverse audience on this channel, and I know that some of the information that I presented in this video isn't going to be new to those of you who practice occultism or astrology or Eastern mysticism. But I want to just say something to my Christian audience for a minute. First of all, numerous Christian ministries have written articles, books, and so on condemning not only Carl Jung, but also typology such as MBTI and the Enneagram. Next, many non-Christians in the typology community mock Christians who practice the MBTI. And I actually found a forum post where another Christian had created a very popular website and then deleted it after he discovered the same type of information that I've discovered. And one forum member on the personalitycafe.com website wrote that, quote, "I just accept that most Christians dabbling in MBTI would run if they knew what Jung really said, cause most hardly go further than the cute little psychological types." And this person is exactly right. And it's sad that non-Christians understand that this is wrong for Christians to practice, yet some Christians don't seem to realize it. Let's take a look at some scriptures. First of all, the Apostle Paul was writing to warn the early Christians about the deceptive philosophies and concepts of the Gnostics. They were trying to infiltrate the church with their ideas of reconciling opposites and avoiding certain meats and so forth. And so the Apostle Paul writes to warn them. And as I've already shown you in this video, Jungian theory, the Enneagram, and basically all of typology is linked to Gnosticism with the basic concept of the duality of reconciling opposites and finding the God within. The second reason this passage is significant is that word rudiments, which comes from the Greek word which literally means elements, and it's referring to the classical elements, the idea that the four elements are controlled by four spirits or four gods. In fact, many newer Bible translations actually go ahead and translate that word as elemental spiritual forces. Martin Edwin, an occult researcher, wrote the following, quote, "Elementalism is the belief that all life forms are controlled by four spirits, which represent the four basic elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. These elements are at the very heart of the practices of fortune-telling, divination, witchcraft, astrology, metaphysics, and temperament profiling." And the Apostle Paul warns us point blank to stay away from this four element, reconciling your opposites nonsense. It's worthless philosophy that will spoil you. Again, the four elements make up the basis of astrology, and the Bible warns against any kind of witchcraft or sorcery or astrology. Next, MBTI attempts to make predictions based on your personality type, and this is a form of divination based on mental processes. It's trying to predict a future or extrapolate certain information about you based on how you perceive the world and make judgments. And this is no different. It's basically modern day palm reading or elementalism. Oh, you're an INTJ? You'll probably want to study computer programming and marry an ENFP, according to a lot of these typology websites. And so while it may not feel like divination, reading someone's type, trying to find out their dominant element, their dominant function, and then predicting their careers, telling them their behaviors, their dating matches, their stresses, it's no different from astrology charts or palm reading or the I Ching. It's all divination based on the elements. Next, the Bible warns against contacting familiar spirits, and Jung and the Enneagram founders promote that as a concept to help you find your true self. Finally, the Bible says to examine ourselves, but only to see if we are living in the faith. Otherwise, we are to deny ourselves, take up the cross, and follow Jesus Christ. And our answers don't come from self-knowledge, but by knowledge of Jesus Christ as Lord, who paid the penalty for our sins by dying on the cross, so that whosoever believeth on him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. So let's just recap what we've learned. First, Jung abandons Christianity and has revealed his agenda to turn Christ back into the soothsaying God of the vine. He received information for his theories from demonic spirit guide, who also happened to mention that Abraxas, aka Satan, was the highest god, of course. His concepts parallel the fundamental teachings found in occultism and mysticism, including the pairs of opposites and the four classical elements. The premise of both Jungian theory and the Enneagram is that finding your true self, based on the Gnostic mystic view that you have a hidden God inside of you, will lead to liberation, to finding that you're a God or have a God within, which has always been the promise of Satan. MBTI is based on Jung's theory, uses his functions and pairs of opposites, and states that their purpose is to make Jung's theory easy to understand and useful in people's lives. In my opinion, to promote or teach MBTI is to promote Jung, which is to promote occultism and an antichrist agenda. Finally, because people choose which options on a personality test fit them best, of course there's going to be a small grain of truth to it, what I call the food, which is where people get confused and sucked into this, but it's not that accurate. That's why people are constantly mistyping and changing their types. That's why the so-called experts using the same exact typology model will disagree with other experts on someone's type. Carl Jung himself has been quoted in some instances of seeming to indicate he thinks he's an ISTP. At other times, Jung seems to think that his type is INTP, and then other quotes it seems like he's an INFJ. Personally, I don't think Carl Jung even knew his type half the time. MBTI used to say INTJs have FE, now they say we have FI as our tertiary function. And the reason that Jungian theory and Enneagram and all this stuff is not science is because the whole premise is based on the pairs of opposites, that duality that the demons taught Jung about. It's based on the thought of the four elements, or mental processes as they call them now. And that's why Jungian theory is not science, guys. It's pseudoscience and occultism, period. And in the end, it will end up corrupting your thinking in many ways. That's what I call the poison. It leads you astray, it corrupts your thinking, and of course it opens the gateway up for you to become conditioned to occult thinking and occult practices. And I know a lot of you just want to find a community of people with whom you can relate, and you want to find out how to overcome some of your challenges, and you're not all just trying to view this as becoming a god and things like that. I understand that. And there are a lot of nice people who get sucked into typology without knowing about the occult connection, and I'm not claiming that Myers-Briggs organization has an underlying occult agenda. For all I know, they may be unaware of Jung's occultism and the things I've mentioned in this video. Nevertheless, we have to ask ourselves, Is Jung's theory a scientific tool to help us understand how we perceive information and make judgments? Or is it a clever deception based on information he received from ghostly entities, which mixes truth with lies, occultism with observations, and is all designed to condition people's minds to think in terms of four elements and the pairs of opposites, the same old occult Gnostic philosophy that supposedly leads to enlightenment and godhood? I wonder.